We left off last time in chapter 16, and we had just covered verse 12 and the sixth angel, the fifth angel. We've had 5 in succession, bowls of judgment poured out, executed on the earth, and now we are up to the 6th. And towards the end of this chapter, I'll try to piece these bowls into the larger tapestry of Revelation and the tribulation that we keep referring back to. So we're getting in deeper water, and it's getting muddier. It's getting harder to understand, and I certainly don't claim to have got it figured out. But I keep reading other people's writings who have spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. So they don't all agree. We're not all going to agree, but I think it's still important for us to go through it.
You say we're getting deeper water and it's getting bloodier.
Yeah. So starting with verse 12 today, the 6th, this is referring to the angel, the 6th poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings of the east. If you remember, just one of the other bowls turned all the rivers to blood. So now this river of blood called Euphrates is going to dry up and disappear. Now, keep in mind that the Euphrates has the Euphrates was a boundary of the original promised land to Abraham. The Euphrates was the eastern boundary, the Mediterranean was the western boundary, and that was the promised land that Abraham was promised by God. So this river Euphrates is symbolic in terms of dividing God's set aside land from the rest of the world, especially the kings of the east. And it talks about these kings of the east. The Euphrates is a major river in that part of the world and doesn't ever dry up. I mean, it originates in the mountains of Turkey. There's a constant, there has been times where it was diverted, made some places dry, or they created dams which interrupted the flow until the dam was filled up, but it's never stopped running water. There's always water running through the Euphrates. In fact, Saddam Hussein, before the war, before he was thrown out, he used to use the Euphrates as punishment to villages or to certain subsects of their religion, and he would divert the water away from an entire region so that they couldn't grow anything, they couldn't drill wells, and they would have to move, or they would have to relocate. So people's messed with the Euphrates, but it's never dried up. So this would be a big deal, and it would be a big deal to a lot of people over a long period, a long pathway. We'll get into why this would prepare a way for the kings of the east. If you're going to move an army, just like Moses was trying to rescue the people and the army was chasing them, if you try to move an army across the river, it becomes difficult, especially back in those days, where you had chariots and horse-drawn and walking soldiers. You don't take boats with you when you move an army generally. So it's difficult to cross a large river with an army. So when these kings, when they prepare to move their armies, it's difficult when there's water. So this angel poured out this bowl, and it prepared a way for the kings of the east to be able to move an army towards Israel. Is this literal? again, you have debate between the scholars, between the experts. Some people see this as symbolic, meaning the resources of Babylon dries up. Their riches, their business partners, their kingdom becomes barren, and the river of Euphrates drying up is symbolic of that type of impact on Babylon from the world.
You got the fan on or off?
Turn it on.
It'd be better for it to be off, wouldn't it? You need,
It is a loud one, isn't it?
okay, it'll go off in a minute. So the literal interpretation is that the river dried up. It would make easy passage and will open up the gates for the armies to march from the east to participate in the Battle of Armageddon, which it goes into a little bit later here. So it should cut off in just a minute. Okay, verse 13. Then I saw three unclean spirits like frogs coming from the dragon's mouth, from the beast's mouth, and from the mouth of the false prophet. For they are demonic spirits performing signs who travel to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for the battle on the great day of God the Almighty. This triple identity here, the three people, the dragon, we've already identified as Satan himself, the devil, and the beast as the Antichrist, and now it names the false prophet as the third beast who came from the earth, if you remember. So we have this trinity of Satan and the Antichrist and the false prophet, and from their mouths spew three unclean spirits. And I read it as that there will be 9 of them. Some people would say there's 3 from the 3, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that there's evil spirits being put to work in the world to gather up the armies against God, the armies who are going to participate in this battle of Armageddon. The spirits like frogs. This is one of those terms where I wouldn't take frogs literally because it doesn't say they are frogs. It says they're like frogs. And kind of like in Leviticus 10, Leviticus 11, verse 10, we find the words, and all that have not fins or scales in the seas and in the rivers, and of all that move in the waters, and of any living thing which is in the waters, they shall be an abomination unto you. They shall be even an abomination unto you. Ye shall not eat their flesh, but ye shall have their carcasses in abomination. So a frog would definitely fall into that category. They're considered unclean, unedible. Stay away from them. They're an abomination. So these unclean spirits are like frogs. They're just as abominable as frogs are. They're not something that you want to mess with. And their mission is to go and convince these kings. And when I say this gets into deep water, it gets confusing because if you think of where we're at with all the judgments that's been pronounced, people are still suffering from sores on their body. They're still being burnt by the sun. It's still being, some of them are blinded and can't see. They're just, all these are piling on to each other. And yet now we're talking about raising armies and marching them across the world to engage in this battle with no water, no. In other words, it's a confusing time. You wonder how anybody could even survive with what's happened, let alone put an army together and continue on. So, but this is what we've got. This is what it says in the Bible. And it gives much justification, I think, to the symbolic interpretation of a lot of this, because you can't precisely fit it into a reasonable scenario in a literal sense. But it says that their purpose is to gather the kings from around the world to prepare for this battle. Okay, so verse 15. And if you've got a red letter text, it'll be in red, because this verse is spoken by Jesus. So this is Jesus's words that John has heard and recorded. Look, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who is alert and remains clothed, so that he may not go around naked and people see his shame. This is a warning from Jesus himself that his coming will be a surprise. It will be unannounced. It will be, we're in this period that's got to be the end of time with all the stuff that's happening. It's got to be getting close. But when it happens, it's going to be a surprise. And those who believe, the saints who study the word, we have a preview of this. We know at least the time's getting close. But those who don't study the word, those who don't understand or know the word, they may very well be clueless, and they may very well end up being caught off guard. Uh, 16. So they assembled the kings at a place called in Hebrew Armageddon. Okay, so now it just outright says it. They sent them out. They got them. They're now gathered. The kings are gathered in this place called Armageddon. Where is Armageddon? Again, there's as many opinions as there are scholars. There is nobody that I've read that has perfectly identified the location of Armageddon. General vicinity, maybe, but in Zechariah 14, verse 2 and 3, it gives us another concept of this. It reads, "For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle." So that sounds like it describes a pretty big battle, all the countries of the world. And we know in history, Rome sacked Jerusalem and tore it down and destroyed the temple and all that in 70 AD. And you could say, well, Rome at that time represented all the countries on earth. So people make that argument that this was already accomplished at 70 AD. We've also gone through several iterations of the 70 AD occurrence doesn't mean that was the only time that's going to happen. That certainly was a time that it did happen. So therefore, it could very well be a repeating occurrence. In Joel 3, verse 1 and 2, it reads, "For behold, in those days and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people and my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. They have also divided up my land. This is talking about the promised land. And if you read that whole chapter of Joel, it seems to describe this battle of Armageddon in 2 or 3 different ways. So they assembled the kings at this place called Armageddon. We have been told by prophets in many places in the Bible that there will be a final major battle of the forces of good and evil. I think that is the natural progression of this and will be the final chapter of all mankind, is this battle of Armageddon. Verse 17. Then the seventh poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, "It is done." These last few verses all happened after the 6th bowl was poured out. Now we get to the 7th bowl. It's done. It is done. If you compare this to what Jesus said on the cross, he said, "It is finished." When Jesus died on the cross, he opened a door to salvation and grace to everyone who would accept it, everyone who will simply turn to him and submit to him as our Savior. He opened that door by saying, "It is finished. I have done what the Father asked me to do to provide grace for the world." Now, from the temple, whether this is the voice of God or whether it's another angel that's announcing it, now the term is, "It is done." And to me, that means the time has now come where that door that Jesus opened is now closed. There is no more salvation. If you haven't already been saved, your time is out. It's over. It is done. That should, it gives me a cold chill, and I'm not even one of them that didn't make it through the door. Verse 18. Now this from here to the end is going to describe what happens when it is done. What happens to the world. Starting with verse 18. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake occurred like no other since people have been on the earth. So great was the quake. You can take this as the end of the world. How the world would end, how it could end. If you're talking about all the armies of the earth, we have recently been hearing words out of the mouth of our president. The president of the United States has said within the last week, well, if Russia starts using nuclear weapons, so are we, and it's going to be the end of the world. I mean, that's what our president is saying. The ability of the United States and Russia and China and France and the other nuclear capable countries certainly have enough nuclear missiles and firepower to destroy a large part of the earth, if not all of it. Is that conceivable? We've been living with that threat now for what, 100 years Yeah, we've, mankind has had that ability to essentially destroy all life on earth for a long time. Now, of course, I'm not saying that that usurps God's authority or sovereignty. Nothing's gonna happen that God doesn't allow happen. Nothing's gonna happen that surprises God or that God doesn't anticipate. But I'm also not sure that God isn't going to use that as the means of ending the world. So if God chooses for that to be the way the world ends, then I'm sure that's the way the world will end. But it says here, it has the largest earthquake that has ever occurred since people have been on the earth. And we'll see what it does to the earth, which is significant. So verse 19, the great city split into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Doesn't say Paris, doesn't say Madrid, it doesn't say Jerusalem, it says the cities of the nations fell. That pretty much means every city of every nation throughout the world.
I think this is. I'll go with the cosmic and less physical. I think this is they all collapse in that way, not every building falls down.
Right. Yeah, I got you. I got you.
Especially when we talk about Babylon the Great. Babylon wasn't just a city, it was an empire and a spirit. So anyway, that's where I'm.
Yeah, and that's, yeah, and that's a prevailing, that is a large segment of people believe that. I would, and I can accept that too. Babylon represents a system, not only governmental, but social, financial, economic. It's a system of government that encompasses a large part of the world. So the cities of the nations fell. The great city, which many assume is Jerusalem, but could be Rome or could be Babylon. There's different people have different thoughts on that. But whether the cities fall down, as in being destroyed by nuclear weapons, or whether they cease to function economically or militarily or whatever, there's destruction of the system.
I think it implies all of it, all of the above. When you're talking about an earthquake, it's felt all over the world like man has never seen. That's going to do some damage everywhere. I think it's both. I think it's going to fall apart, collapse in every way. So we can't really, I mean, that's literal. The earthquake is literal. So I think it's both. Naturally, it's going to be destroyed in every way.
Brought
There's going to
down.
be brought down in every way. There's going to be great physical damage in every country as well.
Yeah, and we can't get into the enough of the details to cover it all because it would be another 6 months. But what you're saying, I there has to be some logical ending of it all. In other words, you can't come to Judgment Day with people running buses and trains and that kind of thing.
I think with scripture, a lot of times we don't realize it's both. It's symbolic and literal. Where that falls, we all have differences
Right.
of veins and thoughts and opinions. But in many cases, it's both.
Sure.
It's always symbolic and it is literal as well,
And
depending on.
it can be. I agree. Okay, in Zechariah 14, verse 4, it reads, And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And on the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof towards the east and towards the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove towards the north and half of it towards the south. Babylon is given a specific threat of God's judgment and God's vengeance. And we will see that here in a minute. But we're definitely going to see Babylon and the system, the Antichrist system of the world, destroyed physically and financially and politically, however it happens. Verse 20, every island fled and the mountains disappeared. The island, I don't know how you could symbolically interpret that. Mountains disappearing. Many times governments are referred to as mountains in the Bible, but then sometimes, like you said, mountains mean mountains.
In general, everything will be level.
Right. Well, and even the islands, which generally
Will be swallowed up.
they're gonna be moved around. If you've ever looked at some of the early world history maps, where it shows before the continents were spread and split apart, where there was one single landmass and then it broke apart and became Europe and North and South America and Australia. We've seen the whole earth be rearranged before. And that's kind of what it sounds like is happening here. Every island fled, mountains disappeared. But like Clint said, many people think all this is symbolic in reference to governments failing, societies revolting and having those kinds of disruptions.
Sounds like that's turning into what the main argument over Revelation is it symbolic or is it literal? That's what everybody's trying to debate over, what's symbolic and what's literal. And
Yes.
we all have our opinions, it could be both, it could be this or it could be that. Here we are as humans in flesh with our opinions.
I feel like if it's too symbolic, then it's speaking a new language. We know what earthquakes are. We know what specific things are described. Some, it's obvious that it's symbolic. Others, it's more literal. Or it would be a totally different interpretation of the same words, same language that we've known throughout, since King James.
I agree, but I think there's also another layer to that,
Yes,
in that the earth will be a new earth.
yes.
After the end of time, after the great day of judgment, the earth will be a new earth. And to me, an earth that God is going to create, a new earth for all eternity or for a millennium or however you take that, you don't do it you don't build the new earth in between the skyscrapers that are already here.
No.
The first thing you do whenever you do a deep remodel on a house, first thing you do is take it all down
All
to the
destroyed.
studs.
And everything's gonna melt with forever at heat also, isn't it?
Yeah, we're talking about fire. And
All the
my thought on wars and like the nuclear capabilities, it tells us that there'll be wars and rumors of wars. So there's definitely gonna be wars. To what degree, we don't really know. It's not specific. And it is implied that the nuclear capabilities, to me, is not going to take over. That may be part, that may be some, but man's ability to destroy the earth with nuclear knowledge, I don't believe it's gonna go that way solely, entirely. I think God's going to be God, and what he says here is what we need to focus on, not wondering things that aren't in here so much, because we can't know.
Yeah.
He chose not to enlighten us in that way.
Yeah, yeah.
But we do know there's gonna be wars.
Okay, let's go on and finish verse 21, because this adds another dilemma here. Enormous hailstones, each weighing about 100 pounds, fell from the sky on people, and they blasphemed God for the plague of hail, because that plague was extremely severe. Now, hailstones of 100 pounds is a big hailstone. It certainly nothing like that's ever happened literally on Earth. But Matthew Henry was pretty convinced that this is exactly what happened in AD 70 in Jerusalem. The walls of Jerusalem, the siege against Jerusalem in 70 AD ended when they finally got catapults that could launch boulders huge enough to knock down those 20-foot thick walls of rock. And so they pulverized Jerusalem for weeks with these huge boulders of 100 pounds and more, and broke down the walls and finally took Jerusalem and essentially killed most everybody. So Matthew Henry believed that this particular verse makes it clear that this is AD 70 in Jerusalem, not some future time past our
Did
time.
it say they were falling from the sky?
They have to fall if you throw them.
Well, that's not falling from the sky though, that's coming through this.
As you watch it come down on you,
It comes like
Yeah.
it's falling from the
But
sky.
also, what about the stars falling from the sky? The literal stars are gonna fall out of the sky,
That is not physically possible.
so
That
that's what there's, that's what, where did we read that? Where the stars,
yeah,
the
that,
moon
that's
was
back
gonna,
in the trumpets.
so
Uh,
what about that?
Well, when you talk about stars falling, well, there is a literal explanation. It's not necessarily symbolic. In other words, when stars fall from the sky, have you ever seen a large meteorite
Sure.
shower
Shooting
of meteorites? When they hit the Earth's atmosphere, they brighten up like as if they look like stars as they're streaking through the sky and hit the ground. So if you saw an asteroid break apart and fall down around you, it would look like stars falling.
Yeah.
So that's a way to interpret it. The very smallest star in the universe couldn't fall on the Earth because it's many, many, many times larger than the Earth. One star would consume the entire Earth. So there couldn't be multiple actual stars falling on the Earth.
As we understand it.
Within the physics, as we know physics and physical science, but the point is that this is the end. It says, he said, God or his spokesman said, it's done. This is it. We're done. We're finished. Now, the next logical thing that's going to happen is Jesus's return and the judgment days, the judgment seat of Christ and the great day of judgment. That's the next sequence. You know, we talk all through Revelation about, we can't say this is happening on the first week of tribulation or the 14th week of, we can't tie which things are happening at what period of the tribulation, and we certainly can't tie the tribulation into the calendar on Earth, 2087. We can't do that, but we can pick up a sequence of things in order that they happen. And this, where we're at now, is the last event. He says, it is done, it is done. There is no more. Now, so that's why, to me, if you say, well, no, it's mostly symbolic, it's all symbolic. Doesn't matter. It's still done. It's over. This is the end. So it doesn't matter whether all the buildings and cities are still standing and the politicians all died,
Exactly.
or whether all the cities fell down and now everything's flattened. It doesn't matter because God says it's done. We have no more.
That's
There's
why to
nothing
me, it's
going to
both.
happen. There's not going to be another tomorrow
Yeah.
where people go to work and ride the bus or the,
In both cases, we can wind up tied up in a pretzel.
Yeah.
Too symbolic. I just say the too symbolic, you're tied up looser than you are if you're trying physical correspondence. Get wound up a little tighter.
now, so that brings us to the end of 16. And so what's the question is, what's next? If this is the end, if we're done, then what's next? Because we got more chapters.
There's a lot more dialogue.
And in my mind, we'll go over that next week, but chapter 17 and 18 basically digress and gives us more detail about what's happening right here in these 6 and 7 bowls when these things. So we're gonna say, okay, well, that's what happened. Now, let me fill in the details of what that looked like,
We got
what
a
it
really
sounded like.
high over in that bit, and now we're tight scenes.
Yeah,
Mhm,
yeah.
mhm.
It's a newsreel, flashes. Okay, but now let's go back. What, how did that exactly happen? That's where we'll start next week.
Larry, Brenda,